Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
And we are very pleased to welcome Simon Conway Morris here this morning, who's the Professor of Evolutionary Paleobiology here in Cambridge. He's held this chair since 1995 and has very much been involved in not only evolutionary biology but increasingly in the whole science-religion discussion over the past few years especially. So delighted he's going to come and speak to us now on evolution and fine-tuning in biology. Thank you so much.
The things, perhaps by way of background, is Dr. Dawkins describes me as a geologist in his last book, which is rather flattering, I have to say. I didn't quite know where he got that idea from, but it is true, I did train as a geologist in Bristol. And one of the things I still remain very interested in is the Cambrian explosion. I won't be talking directly about that. But this is quite a useful diagram, I think, because it encapsulates a whole lot of ways of looking at where we are and where we might or might not be going. As you'll all be aware, we're standing on this planet on round about 4 billion years of history in terms of the fossil record, and we are moderately well informed about that, I think, and especially with regards to some key episodes now. On the other hand, of course, we have this small question as to not the fact that we are deracinated apes, that too is beyond dispute, but nevertheless we are sentient and we have powers of intelligence which far outstrip any other species on the planet, or at least so we'd like to believe. And one of the things we would like to know is not only what are the roots of that consciousness, and that is one of the large unsolved questions, of course, in terms of science, but more particularly, as one is also aware, although the planet is round about 5.5 billion years old, something of that order, the universe is about 3 times older than that, and in that time it's now clear that not only have things like galaxies appeared, but also even in our local neighbourhood, that's within around about 2,000 light years, which is a detectable limit for known extrasolar planets. And the probabilities are strongly pointing towards the fact that there will be many more Earth-like planets than large planets for various reasons, and we would expect, all things being equal, which they aren't necessarily in this place, that at least some of those will be inhabited. And I'll try and persuade you, in fact, that if they are inhabited, they will have organisms which are far too similar to us for comfort. But that's to be returned to in just a moment. So, the take-home message, and I think this is quite important, especially if you're not a scientist, because there's naturally some suspicion in this area, and some of it is justified, is that there's an awful lot to play for, but also, rather unfashionably, it's more than likely that we almost know nothing. The general ideas, especially in this part of Cambridge, people are pretty satisfied with themselves, they go around in wheelchairs telling us about cosmology and all the rest of it. They may or may not be right, but I would be very, very suspicious that we're actually a 1/10 of a percent towards our understanding of what's going on. And that may or may not be encouraging. Now again, I'll go through this quickly, as I already mentioned. One reason, or one suspicion is that there are some aspects about life wherever we will find it, if we find it, which will be universal. There are arguments in various directions on the nature, for example, of whether life has to be carbon-based and water-based, so-called carbaquist. I think the arguments are strongly in that direction, but again, science may yet surprise us. There's also some reasons to think, in fact, that many aspects of biochemistry will also be universal. This is the iconic DNA, of course. That in its own way is a very peculiar molecule. But it's quite likely, I think, that basics of metabolism, basics of replication, basics of the genetic code could all be perhaps rather surprisingly universal. So in that terms, the actual substrate of possibilities is in a certain way constrained. But that's only taking us a fairly small direction, because when we go to look at the history of life on this planet, and this is, for some reason, that slide's being truncated, but that doesn't matter at all. What we've got here is an encapsulation of the history of the Earth. The origin of life has been very tactfully left off, quite right too, because I have the foggiest idea what happened there at all. That's another of the great scientific failures in the last 50 years, which I've got almost nowhere really. That's not to say we won't suddenly do something next week which solves the whole problem, but it's not too encouraging as of Monday morning. We then have a protracted interval known broadly as the Precambrian. And this too is very puzzling, or at least it seems to be, because all things being equal, we expect evolution to be a rather rapid and ratchet-like process. It should build on competitive advantage and adaptational utility. But for much of the Precambrian, I have a colleague here in Cambridge called Nick Butterfield, and he just says simply, nothing happened. It's incredibly slow. It's glacial rates of change. That may be due to the nature of the environment of the Earth. Surface temperatures, for example, may have been elevated. That's one possibility, which might have put a cap on evolution. We then go into the Cambrian explosion itself, and thereafter we have various things which emerge as, for instance, the animals here. We see this gentleman here whose underpants will return to him in due course, and various other sorts of creatures here. Now, a central tenet of neo-Darwinian thinking, and this is by no means restricted to the writings of Stephen Jay Gould, although he is probably the most articulate of a very articulate group of people, is in his famous metaphor, were we to rerun the tape of life, then we would end up with a completely different biosphere. In other words, and this is actually, I think, quite important, it's something which is emphasised by a number of the leading people in this area, and I would otherwise count myself entirely as a neo-Darwinian, but their basic argument would be that humans are, for all intents and purposes, a complete and absolute evolutionary accident. And there are strong ideological, if not metaphysical, reasons why Gould in particular adopted those ideas, although he was sometimes slightly shy of putting them out on the table, given the current difficulties of science and religion. So this idea of rerunning the tape, of course, has attracted the interest of a variety of other people, especially historians. This is a book, actually again the top's been cut off, but it's not important, called More What If, it's edited by Robert Cowley, and here we have a cheerful view of London in 1941 after the destruction of the fighter command by Hermann Goering and the arrival of this appalling individual here, and the deportation of all adult males from this country, which included my father, by the way, so there was a great deal to play for here. It was well worth fighting that war, in my opinion. However, in this particular essay there are a whole set of different historical counterfactuals. I just mentioned one in passing, which I think is historically ingenious, although theologically it's very flawed, and that is to do, and again, fortunately with the audience here, I don't have to explain who this person is or who this person is, but the essay there sort of asks the question, what would have happened, in fact, if historically in Jerusalem on April, whenever it was, the 7th, AD 33, Pontius Pilate had said to his soldiers, release this man here, this carpenter from Nazareth, give him a beating, but just chuck him out. How might have history gone in a particularly different direction? The essay itself is very ingenious, and I highly recommend it to you if you do in the book itself. So those sorts of counterfactuals, the idea which very much, especially in the West, we're haunted by sort of the general relativistic, not in the terms of physics, but in the sense that we're somehow free agents, and if we make a particular sliding door choice in one direction or another direction, then history might go in a completely unexpected direction. In other words, there's no fundamental plan there. In addition, why I think this might not be correct is because I go to the States quite often, too often some people say. I'm on their list, needless to say, and one of the nice things about being in the United States is you're allowed to engage in shameless self-publicity and self-promotion. So the greatest of Cambridge modesty, I very modestly draw attention to this book here, down in Cambridge University Bookshop and so forth. But what I've tried to argue in a book published several years ago is that the subtitle is more important in the sense than the title. I think that in fact humans are very much on the evolutionary cards for reasons I'll try and explain, which are perfectly orthodox in terms of evolutionary thinking. Though I won't go into the details here, paradoxically we may actually be completely alone, and that seems absolutely ridiculous. So there's something here, this doesn't, I mean in terms of current thinking, this doesn't add up in terms of neo-Darwinism, this doesn't add up in terms of what we know about the universe around us. Now, another aspect about evolution which I just want to mention very briefly, I don't know, Polly, is it possible to reformat this thing? It's cutting off half the slides. I don't know if it's impossible, we won't worry, but if for some reason it sort of wants to censor that side, I don't know if there's a... Yeah, it's fine on the screen as you can see, but sorry to keep... If it's not, we'll plough on, but if we can get a slightly smaller screen size on it. If it says no, or I'm Gordon Brown, then we'll just move on. Well, that's too much. Fine before, but that's the way computers move.
So Monday morning feeling.
Absolutely, it's got a headache. That's right. It's all blank. So, if not, we'll just press on. It's not going to. That's better. Yeah, I think. Thank you very much. Thanks. That's appreciated. Thank you. And I presume that tag will just be in a second. Yeah. Thank you. One other aspect which is worth mentioning in passing with regards to evolutionary possibilities, which is relatively underappreciated, I think, is that, of course, people like ourselves are enormously impressed by various sorts of biological complexity, and the example is the eye in terms of the Darwinian paradigm and the way in which it is very precisely engineered. However, what is slightly less appreciated is that the substrate for nearly all complex structures, which includes things like brains, by the way, involve molecular systems which have evolved long, long before those complex organs themselves have appeared. So in the case of the eye, now again, I'll go into the gory details if you're interested, but effectively the eye is doing two things. It's being transparent, which is pretty impressive biologically if you give it a moment's thought, and of course it's also got to provide a transduction mechanism, by which we mean that the photons are converted into an electrical signal, which in a way which is not entirely clear, provides us with vision. All those proteins evolved either in bacteria or in microbes long before there was any eye, billions of years before there were any eye. So the argument which is sometimes used that somehow these things are improbable because they're difficult to make, I think is implausible, at least so far as the builder's yard is concerned. All this stuff is lying around in the yard, and all you need is a competent architecture. Now, in terms of exploring the ways in which evolution might go, I'm going to emphasize very much my own obsession, and sadly it is an obsession, it's like being a teenager, gets rather sweet, to do with convergence, but I'll just mention two other aspects about the way we can begin to approach this problem. Now, Stephen Jay Gould's famous metaphor of rerunning the tape of life, in fact, in the last 10 to 15 years, various groups, especially a chap called Rick Lenski in East Lansing in Michigan, has done some very interesting experiments doing exactly that. And the trick is to take bacteria, E. coli is generally the organism of choice, and what you do is you allow it to evolve. Now, there are two very important aspects about these experiments. The first is that you can freeze the ancestral population. So basically you make a fossil record, and you can wake up that fossil record in a way which paleontologists can't do, and compare it with the descendants which have been busy evolving. Because E. coli, when it's happy, can divide every 20 minutes, then you can, in principle, have a very rapidly evolving population. The other thing is you can go completely mad with your grant application and ask for not one milk bottle, but 12. The reason for that is that you then put E. coli into each of the 12 bottles. Therefore, you have 12 separate histories. So you're rerunning the tape of life 12 times, or as many times as you can afford milk bottles, or the patients to study E. coli. Now, one of those milk bottles, for instance, might be hit by a cosmic ray, which leads to a mutation, which then leads to a completely new trajectory, which is independent of the other 11 milk bottles. So one can see here that there's a real possibility of investigating the roles of history. And the net result of this, it's a rather complex area. There have been many experiments done. This is actually a report from Science some years ago, but it pretty well captures the main conclusions. What we see here is 1,000 generations of evolution with a blue dot, and this is our starting point here. And you can divide the evolution into three aspects. There's chance, that's the big maybe, the fighter command collapsing under the onslaught of the Luftwaffe. History, that's rerunning it, so we have 12 Luftwaffes and 12 fighter commands. And of course we have good old Darwinian adaptation here. In other words, are organisms actually good at dealing with their environment, which of course, as we say in this country, as any fool know, is what happens. But what you can see is chance doesn't matter. It's really sure it happens, but it's not really very interesting. History significantly becomes less and less important because adaptation becomes more and more important. So that's a sort of indication there that things which are often thought to be very important in evolution, chance and history, may, at least in the case of milk bottles of E. coli living in milk bottles, or agar plates, may not be as significant as people thought. The other aspect to do with the way we can investigate things is to inquire whether, in fact, there are biological designs, and I should say, just in parenthesis, that when I use words like design, of course everyone's ears prick up like this. There's no intelligent design in here at all. We simply don't have a vocabulary which allows us to talk about these things, which at one level are patently engineered, yet are not necessarily the result of a master designer. But in that respect, one can say, well, are there various biological structures which in principle would be a very good idea, but have failed to evolve? And the classic example in this context is the evolution of the wheel. A number of you will be familiar with the famous bacterial flagella motor, which is a sort of wheel. But in macroscopic terms, it would seem intuitively that making this sort of arrangement of axles and ball bearings and so forth would be problematic. But in point of fact, it's less clear that it's really a biomechanical question as to the fact that, as you can see here on the capital, you need a planet which does not consist of rugged surfaces. Any of you who've had the misfortune to be in a wheelchair or pushing someone around will know how important a very, very flat surface is. The smallest irregularities, the topography there, compromises the activity of wheels. And the problem with this planet, of course, is it has got things like the Himalayas, that sort of area. And when it does have large flat areas, they're typically mud, which are soft and sticky, and thereby not suitable for the action of wheels. And it does seem, and there's a rather nice essay by Michael Barber, a very talented anatomist in Chicago, he would argue, and I would agree with this, that it's not a biomechanical impossibility, it's simply the nature of the substrates on which you find yourself. If you want to get around on this planet, basically what you can do is these things here, they're called levers. We'll come back to that in just a moment. So there are two ways we can ask the question, what else ought to happen? We can rerun the tape of life, at least in restricted circumstances, in rapidly evolving organisms, or we can say, well, are there things which ought to evolve? And I myself find it pretty difficult to think of any particular organisation which has failed to evolve. Well, despite all that, and again going on about some of the neo-Darwinian thinking, which, as I said, emphasises the randomness and open-endedness of evolution, Jared Diamond has speculated that, in, I think, a slightly peculiar way, but he's drawn attention to the fact that the woodpecker, as you can see here, is, as we say, monophyletic. That is, as far as we know, there was only one original woodpecker. And it's a very highly designed organism. As you probably know, it's got this claw-like arrangement, the reverse claw there to hang onto the bark. It's got this stiff tail here. It's got a prehensile tongue. And in particular, it's got this remarkable skull structure here. So when it goes like that, it doesn't fall unconscious off the tree. So it continues to eat on the insects. And Diamond takes a rather, I think, curious aspect, or a curious part of his argument is, he says, well, these are unique. And therefore, it's just as likely that humans, especially those who might want to invent radio telescopes, are also unique. After all, it's just another example. You know, it's as interesting as a tulip in its own way. What I find very odd about this argument is that Jared Diamond is a very agreeable chap, I know him very slightly, but he's a very competent ornithologist. Woodpecker is not unique. I mean, I don't know where he got this idea from. There are two other groups of birds. Actually, there are three, one in Hawaii, but there's one group in Malagasy, the Bangids, and also the Funarids, which are a large neotropical group. And some of the Funarids have a skull structure which has approached very, very closely the woodpecker, and it's used for exactly the same function. So that does seem to be sort of, it's quite, again, difficult to think something which really only evolved once. It's not only a question of everything that has evolved, but everything has evolved more than once. And again, for those of you who are not biologists, and I'm fully aware that there are quite a few biologists here, to introduce the topic of convergence, I'll give you a very simple example, and then we'll go into the area of the evolution of sensory systems, then we'll go completely mad and talk about some rather arcane stuff to do with the possible roots of consciousness around about 11:30, Dennis, if that's okay. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, here we have two placental mammals, cow and the girl here. The girl, when she grows up, should she become pregnant, will have an extended gestation period, as indeed relatively does the cow. There's another important group of mammals which we call the marsupials. And here we have father, who's looking pretty relaxed about the whole business, and so he should, because this is his child. There we are, isn't it sweet? The child, of course, is born at a much earlier stage, and then inhabits the marsupium, the pouch of the female, and literally fuses itself to the mammary titty, and only later becomes effectively free-living as a joey. So reproductively, this is a pretty different way of doing these things. Now let me show you an example of a mammal which is not necessarily a kangaroo or a cow. This is a fairly dangerous cat in side view here. These are the teeth which chew up the meat, the so-called carnassials, and the reason they're chewing it up is because the defenceless ungulate is hemorrhaged wildly because it's had this stabbing canine here, and notice also the protective flange in that area there. This saber-toothed cat is extinct, as indeed is the other one, because here we have the reconstruction of that cat. Again in side view, here's that flange there. Here's another saber-toothed cat. Here you can see the skull structure is a little bit different, but nevertheless, these two are strikingly similar. The point about this cat is it lives in South America, or did. It's extinct. This cat lives rather more widely, Asia, North America, Europe. That's our classic saber-toothed cat. And the crucial thing to appreciate is that these two cats are rather different. This is a marsupial, and this is a placental. So in other words, and to drive this phylogenetically home, this is much more closely related to a wombat, and this is much more closely related to a hedgehog than they are to each other. So it's quite a striking example of convergence. Now, my professional colleagues get rather cross at this stage, so they should, I suppose, and they say, no, Simon, you're playing fast and loose with this. You know, the fact of the matter is that the post-cranial skeleton, all these sorts of things, they're different. And there are indeed even obvious differences in the skull structure of these two cats. But my reply to that, I'm afraid, is slightly brutal, to the effect that it makes no difference whether you're eaten by this cat or whether you're eaten by that cat, really, so I'm completely academic, but that's more important. Now, one of the other curiosities I've found, having been reading about convergence for some years now, is that in the mainstream literature, the vocabulary is almost always using adjectives of surprise. Words like stunning or remarkable, astonishing or uncanny are routinely used to describe such examples of convergence. And I find that slightly curious, in fact, because after all, this is simply a product of adaptation. And I think what makes people a little bit uneasy is that the degree of similarity in many examples of convergence, at least at one level, is really quite striking. And although it's really in parenthesis, it might be worth just trying to make the point at the moment that by and large evolution, I think, has assumed, as I've already indicated, that effectively almost anything is possible. Whereas my sense is very much the reverse. In point of fact, I think almost everything is impossible. It's not the fact that you have this unlimited hyperspace of possibilities. I think, in fact, the number of destinations is very restricted indeed. Now, with respect to examples of convergence, I'll just give you two examples at either end of the spectrum, again to sort of drive home the message if I can. The first is at the molecular level, because at the molecular level you would imagine, I think intuitively, that finding convergence would be very unlikely indeed. And the reason for that is perfectly straightforward, is because typically molecules are made of chains of building blocks. In a protein, they're the amino acids. So if you've got a protein which has 500 amino acids, and if in principle, which is not quite true, but if in principle any one of the 20 amino acids which life uses can be put in any one position, you will appreciate that the combinatorial number is enormous. It's far bigger than what astronomers. As astronomers deal with small numbers, biologists really deal with big numbers. So if you ended up with a protein which was identical, but you had other good reason to think was unrelated, then I would stop believing in evolution, in fact. But of course you don't find that, but you still find very interesting examples of convergence. And let me give you an example. This is not technical, but it takes a minute to explain. We're all carbon-based, and the way you keep carbon on planets, whether they're dead or alive, is in carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide has a disadvantage. It's actually a pig of a molecule. It's very toughly bonded. It's not easy to split apart at all. But the only way we're going to get hold of that stuff is devising a way of obtaining the carbon by splitting the carbon dioxide. You do that by the process of hydration. We use an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, which is a fantastically efficient enzyme. Some enzymes, this is again in parentheses, are absolute walking disaster, but this one is brilliant. It's far beyond the dreams of any chemical engineer. Greatly accelerates the reaction. Now, intuitively, and I think this is quite an important point, if we're all carbon-based, if we all come from an original cell, one would imagine that carbonic anhydrase would be universal. Everybody would use the same carbonic anhydrase because you can't go through life without it. But oddly enough, it turns out that carbonic anhydrase has evolved independently at least 4, if not 5 times. And this is the story here. The little blue area is in fact the area of convergence. The rest of the protein, a single site here, 4 sites here, 3 sites here. These proteins are completely unrelated, but they are all responsible for dealing with carbon dioxide, be it in the case of building our bones, as shown here, be it in the case of our respiration, where carbon dioxide is leaving our bloodstream, be it in the case of photosynthesis. And the reason we know this is convergent is because this is a zinc atom and it has 3 amino acids in association with it, which are, for all intents and purposes, completely invariable. And again, I think this is quite important. We have no idea why carbonic anhydrase has been reinvented. That, as far as I know, has never been investigated. But what it suggests to me again is this is pointed towards a fundamental predictability in evolution. And as those of you who are biologists or read the biological literature, unlike physics and chemistry, biology is just made of exceptions. That's why some of us like it and physicists loathe it. Whereas here, it would seem to me that we can now say, well, wherever you are in the universe, if you have carbon-based life form, it will use carbonic anhydrase. It's a prediction, but that's the way we try and do some of our science. So at the molecular level, there are many examples, in fact, of convergence of a particular sort. At the other level, and it is a little early in the morning, I grant you, but I thought I'd give you an example from behaviour. And this is one of my favourite tipples, I'm afraid to say. You don't want too much tonic. I can't warn you too carefully about that. The point about behaviour is that when we get inebriated, then we go through various behavioural mechanisms. I don't have to go into all the detail, you know as well as I do by and large. But flies show a highly convergent behaviour, especially fruit flies. Now, fruit flies have to go to fruit, of course. Fruit has the propensity to rot and thereby produce alcohols. And the fly has to deal with the alcohol, because alcohol, as I don't have to tell you, is also a very interesting poison. So what you do is you test the reaction of the flies to alcohol in a special experimental object known as the, and I'm not joking here, I never joke in any case, known as the inebriometer. you people, I wish you'd take this seriously. You disappoint me already. What the inebriometer does is there are about 500 chambers, each with a fly, and you shine a light beam through each one of those chambers, and every time the leg crosses the light beam, then it registers. And the more drunk the flies get, then the more the registers go up. So what we see is the flies are introduced into an alcohol-saturated atmosphere here, and now think what a cocktail party's like, okay? First drink arrives, the roar of conversation, that's the speed of the legs, exactly the same thing. Then everybody has their first dry martini, there's a slight panic because all the waiters have disappeared, there's no sign of any more booze, so the conversation drops off. But then suddenly you've thought, thank goodness, another phalanx of trays coming through the door, and everybody's going like this and stuff. But the conversation's not quite as animated, no, people are getting slightly slurred. And in the case of the flies, they move more and more slowly, and at least so far as the flies are concerned, this is the point of death. So that is a behavioural convergence, and again there are some interesting examples in that area. So convergence really spans the entire area. Now, one other example before I go into the evolution of the sensory systems, because again I've got a lot to go through. A very important aspect of this is the danger of taking things superficially. And there are a number of very interesting papers in the last few years which have emphasised the way in which the convergences are very much more than skin deep. And I could give you a number, but I'll actually deal with the octopus. The octopus is interesting in many respects, but a number of hard-headed biologists have emphasised in many respects how alien the octopus. You know, if anything else was not like us, it's the octopus. And what could be more unlike us than these sort of writhing tentacles here? But it turns out, in fact, that if you do high-speed photography of the behaviour of those tentacles when they're given a piece of food here, in point of fact, they arrange the tentacle in exactly the same way as our arm. What happens, in fact, is that their muscular contractions move along in opposite directions, and when they meet, they form a joint. But almost invariably, they form the same arrangements of our wrist, my wrist here, my elbow here, and the attachment to the scapula in that area there. And there's a whole lot of statistical information to show that these two proportions remain the same, irrespective of how long you're actually using, what lengths you're using on the tentacle. So in other words, although that tentacle typically looks like a writhing, sort of flapping sort of thing, which has got no similarity to the vertebrate arm, biomechanically it is highly convergent. And in this paper, which was published in Nature, there's been some subsequent work, which has to some extent put further gloss on this. What they emphasise is that it's rather sort of interesting, so I don't have the quote here, but it's sort of throwaway sentence at the end, so you can see them all scratching their head and saying, well, you know, this is the way you do it. This is optimal. There isn't another way of doing it. And that suggests again, and I could give you other examples of locomotion in particular, to suggest that things which look utterly alien may in fact be far closer to standard arrangements than at first might meet the eye. I better mention this as a passing. One other aspect of convergence which is very familiar is to do with mimicry. That is whereby one animal, typically, though it can extend to other organisms as well, resembles another one. This is an octopus which lives near Java, and this is one of the most accomplished mimics we've come across, because amongst the many things it can do is that in the same waters you find these sea snakes, which are pretty dangerous animals. Here is the octopus, pretending to be a sea snake. And in point of fact, this octopus can resemble a whole set of different venomous animals. And there's some evidence that suggests it actually chooses what I'm going to be today. Today I shall be a sea snake. No, I'm going to be an anemone today, and so forth. So it actually has a series of conscious decisions in that sort of way. And in terms of mimicry, just one other example in passing. Here we can see another snake. You see the eyes here, here's the jaw. And if you go up towards this snake, of course, it would go like that. You do this sort of this thing. There's only one thing wrong with this snake, and of course, it's not a snake at all. It's a caterpillar, as it turns out. But, you know. So such examples of mimicry are, if you like, the only widely accepted area of convergence in biology. But they, in their own way, are highly instructive. Right, on to the main areas, because I must move along very quickly. Presumably, somewhere down the line, our sentience and our consciousness have at least some necessary input from sensory systems. I'm not saying they're all that, I don't think they are at all, but nevertheless, the accumulation of external data must do some part in the end of understanding the world, even as a scientist, and we don't go into Kant and all that sort of stuff. I'll talk very briefly about the evolution of the eye. We, of course, are descendants of the fish. I should say, in passing, very unfairly, I call this my head of department slide. You see the mad glare there, you see the fleeing staff, you see the murk, you see the wreck in the background. It all makes sense. But, the convergence of the camera eye between ourselves, and those of you who are not biologists might need to be reminded we are very closely related to the starfish. Overwhelming evidence for that. It's a good fossil record now, as it so turns out. And the camera eye in the mollusks, and here we have it in a cuttlefish, I believe, which of course are closely related to the oyster and so forth. And beyond all reasonable doubt, the common ancestor of this group, which we call the deuterostomes, and this group, which we call the lophotrochozones, did not possess that camera eye around about 550 million years ago. Won't worry about that. It's a small addition. So we can see that the similarity between the eye of what we call the cephalopods, that's a squid or octopus, and ourselves, is strikingly similar. It's worth stressing that in all the examples of convergence, there is always an evolutionary footprint, and I don't have time to go into the details, but the position of the retina is reversed in the vertebrates in comparison to the cephalopods, and the reason for that is effectively because they have different evolutionary origins, which are reflected in their different embryology. They are never identical, they are just very similar. In addition, a camera-like eye has evolved in this group here, which includes the earthworms, but this is a marine form, the so-called annelids, and the camera-like eye has evolved independently something like 7 or 8 times. And almost invariably, that camera-like eye is found in animals which move rapidly, they tend to hunt their predators, and they are typically intelligent. So that's a quite interesting combination to have if you want to have a camera eye. But of course, camera eyes aren't the only solution on the block. As you'll all know, there are many sorts of eyes. There are actually more than 40 different sorts of eyes. But the first approximation, if you're going to be looked at by anybody else, you're either going to be looked at through a camera eye or through here, the alternative, the compound eye. Now, the compound eye, of course, as the name suggests, is composed of very many lenses. And typically, and this is quite an important point again, I think, in science fiction movies, the spacecraft lands, the ramp goes down, and these sort of empathy-free aliens come down with compound eyes with laser cannons, sort of hosing in everybody in sight like that. You don't know what they're thinking, sort of thing. Compound eye has evolved independently at least 4 times, but it actually shows relative disadvantages to the camera eye in terms of the ability to collect as much light. You can, for example, only put a finite number of lenses on an eye. You can only make the lenses of a certain size. If they're too small, they simply won't act as waveguides. And a rather ingenious thought experiment by a German physiologist, a man called Kuno Kirschfeld, said, let's make the thought experiment of saying, God actually doesn't allow camera eyes for one reason or the other. Everybody, you know, and now I must tell you, must have a compound eye. So what size of eye would we require to have the visual acuity which we enjoy with a camera eye? And the answer is literally pretty sobering. It's not good news. You would need an eye, actually, Kirschfeld suggests, in the order of 10 meters of diameter. And that, I think, again, is important because it does suggest that as and when the aliens arrive, as and when the spaceship comes down, as and when the ramp comes down, if they're coming down with their laser cannon and compound eyes, don't worry, they're really not very dangerous at all. But if they come down with camera eyes, then you must run away as fast as possible. They're going to be far more like you than is comfortable to admit. So again, there is a sense that there are degrees of predictability in what we can find here. Now, other sorts of examples of sensory systems which look rather alien, but in fact may be more similar than sometimes realised. The Americans here will probably know this immediately as the star-nosed mole. It has, of course, nostrils, which are shown here. But the surrounding area here is converted into a series of highly flexible and highly tactile tentacles. To cut a long story short, it's been shown very interestingly that the basic neurobiology of this tentacular system, in point of fact, is remarkably convergent on the eye. And that, of course, begins to introduce an interesting philosophical question, because it goes back to the standard thing about what sense experience is and how we actually make any sense of anything at all. And there's no reason why you can't understand the world through your nose, literally through olfaction or through tactile senses here. Because the likelihood is you will interpret it in much the same way. So again, you can see a deeper-seated similarity. I'll just skip the next couple of slides because they're interesting, but I need to move on. Then to do more with the star-nosed mole. And you can then go into very alien areas, for instance, those groups of animals, especially the fish, though not exclusively so, which generate an electrical field around themselves, and that typically is an aquatic phenomena, and then pick up distortions of that electrical field, and thereby interpret their surrounding environment. Now, these sorts of fish, although shown here in broad daylight, very often are nocturnal. They either live in nocturnal environments or very dark, gloomy environments, and are occupying effectively an electrical world. And the interesting thing here is twofold. First of all, there are good reasons to think that effectively they are seeing electrically, but more particularly in terms of the specific convergence. Here we have the elephant-nosed fish from Africa. The gymnoted fish in South America are, for all intents and purposes, completely unrelated, but have evolved exactly the same system of electrogeneration and electroreception. Once again, you find that only a few ways of doing things. And I'll come back to dolphins, of course. Therefore, this, to my way of thinking, allows us to reinvestigate Thomas Nagel's famous complaint in the essay he wrote in the 70s about what is it like to have the mind of a bat. And this again touches on the questions, I think, of sentience. Because his argument, which I think at that time was perfectly reasonable, is that we'll never know what the mind of a bat is like. It's a completely alien world. How can we possibly understand it? But I begin to think now that both the convergences within sensory systems and the underlying convergences between sensory systems, assume they've got something to do with our mental substrate, might suggest that mentality itself, like carbonic anhydrase, in principle is universal. And thereby one has some degree of predictability about what we might be finding. And you can see, I mean, if there's anything in this, I mean, you know, anybody's a biologist, I mean, this is, you know, this is finger-tingling stuff. We might be onto something. Well, that's all fine and large, but we take a spaceship, we travel thousands of light years, we find an Earth-like planet, we land on the beach where the parties are, of course. We've already established it's got an ocean, an atmosphere, and all the other things we need for advanced life. We open the hatch and we see this. Well, we assume we've just been going in circles. So what I'm now trying to persuade you, in point of fact, is that even this is not quite as improbable as it first might appear. Or is it? Because, again, Stephen Jay Gould, who was, I suppose, the spokesman over the last 30 years for evolutionary biology, not only emphasised the importance of rerunning the tape of life, as I said, for his own ideological reasons, but also emphasised the role of mass extinctions. Why do we know that this is impossible? Why do we know that the domestication of dinosaurs never occurred? And again, I should say in parenthesis, most unfairly, I really feel rather ashamed about this now I mention it, but I call this the graduation ceremony in Oxford. See all those dinosaurs over there? There's young Richard, bless him, yes, etc., etc. Doomed to extinction, as well. Well, the reason we know it's impossible, of course, is because some clown dropped a large rock on the sky 65 million years ago on a June day, as it so turns out, and this led to the disappearance of all the great reptiles, not only those on land, but those in the sea and those on the ocean. And thereby, as Gould emphasised, and I think this is absolutely, sorry, I'll skip that one because I don't have time, thereby he emphasised that had that not happened, then we would not have the possibility of the radiation of the mammals, so we would have no bats going back into the skies. We would not have the reinvasion of the oceans because it would be full of ichthyosaurs and mosasaurs and goodness knows what else, by the whales, for example. And most importantly, of course, we wouldn't have a group called the primates, some of whom decide to come down out of the trees, more or less, and become the great apes, and thereby our evolutionary history would have been irrevocably derailed 65 million years ago had the asteroid missed the Earth. Now, I think historically that's absolutely correct, but I think, in fact, it makes no difference at all. And the reason I think it makes no difference at all is you can do counterfactuals. And one of the other things we have reason to think are probably universal on Earth-like planets are glaciations. They're due to greenhouse gases and ocean continent configurations. They're recurrent on this planet. And I want you to imagine a counterfactual whereby the asteroid misses, So the dinosaurs carry on. The world's full of reptiles. But remember, of course, living with the dinosaurs, there were birds and mammals. And recall also, as I'll re-emphasise in a moment, birds and mammals are both warm-blooded. So these birds and mammals, therefore, are in a counterfactual world, which then goes into glaciation. So what happens is that the temperate and polar areas become much colder. To the first approximation, as is true today, reptiles are not very well adapted to those environments. Whereas those groups which are socially more adept, more intelligent, and have a propensity to independently evolve technology, I'm now talking about the birds, of course, will thereby begin to radiate under this new environmental challenge, and that will then trigger the mass extinction of the dinosaurs. Roughly 30 million years behind schedule, but that's not too bad. So in other words, the mass extinctions are interesting, great fun to teach, but I think in terms of evolutionary consequences, their only significance is they can accelerate something. Conceivably they might postpone, but I don't think they'll ever cancel, so far as I can make out. And in that context then, I just want to say a few things about what we are beginning to understand about the evolution of the birds. They too are turning out to be much more interesting, even than was thought even a few years ago. This is a slightly implausible photograph, because you don't often see horses and penguins living together. This, of course, is the Falkland Islands. And the warm-bloodedness of these birds evolved independently of the warm-bloodedness of these mammals here. Of course, for all intents and purposes, these are feathered dinosaurs in any case. So that when people say, well, supposing the dinosaurs have gone extinct as matter, they turned into birds, it doesn't make a great deal of difference. That warm-bloodedness is probably a prerequisite for a stable brain state and also a stable body state and a large brain. Quickly, we also know that the vocalization in the birds, which evolved independently within the birds at least 3 times, has many striking convergences with mammalian vocalization, including the way in which our children learn how to speak. This involves not only the so-called babbling phase and the tutoring by many birds, but also the neurobiology of the circuits within the brain are remarkably similar to what we see in the mammals, but they're independent. Maybe there are only a few ways to learn how to sing. I'll skip that one again. In addition, we have, not we, but people have documented in the last few years that something we take entirely for granted, and is very widespread in the mammals, that is social play, which can be divided into roughly 6 categories. Shows amongst the more intelligent birds, especially the crows, unsurprisingly, and also the parrots, a one-to-one correspondence. And so here we have the kea, which is a high-altitude parrot living in New Zealand, involved in tug-of-war, mock racing, and the young keas like to go around as delinquent gangs, trashing things, and here you can see them dismantling an armchair. They're highly intelligent birds. But this is again important because social play is one aspect about exploring the world around us, and something we take too much for granted in some respects. But it turns out, at least in this case, if you're going to learn how to play, there are probably only a few ways in which you can actually do it. The most interesting thing, I think, the most remarkable, is to do with the tool-making abilities of the birds, most famously the New Caledonian crow, both in captivity and in terms of the wild environment in the island of New Caledonia. It's been shown that they make a variety of tools. Here shown as having made a probe extracting an insect from a recess. This one lives actually in Oxford, as it so turns out. But what I think is extraordinarily interesting is in the wild, what they do is they strip out these pandanus spines and they actually modify those probes, and they also make hooks, by the way, to extract insects, but they are modified for specific functions in for specific needs. In other words, they will show successive modification of a tool, and that is a proto-technology. And any of you who've held an older one, hand axe, well, it's not really a hand axe, a chopper, and said, well, go back 2 million years and see what we were doing. This is way in advance of what any chimpanzee can do. But on the other hand, it's probably not so different from what we were doing 2 million years ago. And that shows here the successive modification which are used for particular functions. And this, I think, then begins to get onto the heart of what I have to say. Unfortunately, I've only got 10 minutes left to say it in. If I have another 5 minutes, I'd be grateful. But
Another 5 minutes if we need it. So.
Thank you, Ben. I'd be most grateful for that. Thank you. Nikki Clayton in this university, along with her husband Nathan Emery, has done a series of quite brilliant papers on crow mentality. And again, I'm going fast and loose here. But she argues that not only is it very likely that crows in particular do have a theory of mind, but in particular that their complex cognitive states, which we can divide in a sort of way into things like imagination or thinking ahead or flexible behaviour, map one-to-one between what we see in the crow brain and what we see in the chimp brain, which whereby is our ancestor. They are thinking in the same way. Why does that matter? Well, I think this is extremely important because it turns out that though, of course, the brain of the bird is much smaller than ourselves because it's a smaller animal, more significantly, the brain structure of the birds is utterly different from the brain structure of the mammals. This is effectively a Mel arrangement, this is a so-called nucleate arrangement. So you then have to stand back slightly and say, well, how come they are finding the same cognitive landscapes? And there I think things become quite interesting because, of course, the standard response, that may well be true, by the way, I'm not saying it's out of court, is, well, you know, it's a chemistry, old boy. You know, you say, well, yeah, very good. And the molecules, now which molecules are actually producing this thought? And then people get a bit shifty. Of course, we know perfectly well why, because we don't have the foggiest idea why we manage to produce those sorts of things. But if it turns out that different neural structures produce similar cognitive landscapes, which are thereby, as Nick is emphasising in the papers, convergent, then one can begin to appreciate that we might be into some slightly more interesting territory. Those aspects of brain evolution also have parallels in other groups. And I just want to say a couple of things about the dolphins. The dolphins are fun to look at. First of all, because independently of ourselves, they show this spectacular increase in brain size. And more particularly, as I'll show you in a moment, they have remarkable cognitive similarities. Here I've got a primate, here I've got a dolphin here. And this cognitive landscape made by these two mammals, not a bird, are similar. The increase in brain size of the humans, of course, is quite well documented. This is a little bit out of date. But if we go through the last 3.5 million years, you can see these red dots mark this remarkable increase in our cranial capacity, whereby we have a brain which is roughly 7 times too big for our body. However, only about 1.5 million years ago did the human trajectory of brain size increase pull past the brain size of the dolphins, who had achieved larger brains some 10 to 15 million years earlier than that. So prior to that, they were the largest brained species on the planet, and by this stage we may well have been inventing fire. They use tools. Here we have the use of sponges as a sort of natural glove. There's a population in Shark Bay in West Australia. But this, in a way, sort of encapsulates both their playfulness. They like to blow these rings of bubbles out of the blowhole here, which they're very playful with. But in many aspects, the cognitive landscape of the dolphins, again, maps closely to that of the great apes in such things as syntactical and semantic abilities, and their ability to memorize things. Also, their ability to recognize themselves in mirrors, which I'll come back to in a moment. But why this is important is, I think that, first of all, although we also are mammals, actually the brain structure of the dolphins is not so similar to ourselves, it's more archaic. But more significantly is that they are living in a completely different environment. I mean, after all, if you're a crow and an ape, you sit in a tree. I mean, you wouldn't be terribly surprised if you basically made the same world picture, you know, rule 1, don't fall down the tree, and so forth. But if you're living in an ocean, and also using echolocation, which is independent of the bats, one might perhaps suggest that there you would build a different cognitive world, but you don't. The same cognitive world emerges. And these aspects about animal mentality go much further. Now, I'm just going to say a tiny bit about this famous animal here. This is Bamsa. And I'll say a tiny bit about elephants, and then I'll begin to wrap up. I think we radically underappreciate, generally, the question of animal mentality. Now, obviously, it's a rather sensitive ground in a number of respects, because it's got to do with, are you a vegetarian? No, I'm not. Do you like dogs? Yes, I do, and so forth. I'll just give you this one story. Bamsa was a Norwegian dog which fled with his crew to Scotland, in fact, when Norway was occupied by the Nazis. And Bamsa was the most extraordinary animal, because he was a great hit with the crew, but in particular, he was very fond of them. And he noticed the crew used to go down into town, and they go to the pubs and get drunk. So Bamsa used to go down and wait for them at the bus stop for them to come back. Fine, large dogs do that quite often. But Bamsa wasn't happy with this. He decided actually he'd better go a bit further afield. He then learned to get onto the bus, and he'd go into town by himself and wander around the various bars and listen for the Norwegian voices, and if he heard them, he'd then go in and tug them and take them back home. And as after this, Bamsa became so well known, because he always went upstairs, dogs weren't allowed downstairs, he understood that as well, that the local people in Dundee actually gave Bamsa a bus pass so he could... And those of you Americans in particular will probably know a comparable story about Stubby, one of the very famous dogs of the First World War. But there are all sorts of anecdotal stories about the intelligence of animals, which again, I don't want to get too dewy-eyed and Barbara Cartland about this, but nevertheless there are aspects about them which I think we underappreciated. And if that is true for the dogs, some people say cats, I don't believe it myself, that's another story. If that is true of the dogs, it's even more true of the elephants. Now the elephants, again, there's a lot of mystique and mythology and various other things, but what I find very interesting about them are three things. The first is they don't have particularly big brains. They're big animals, but their brain is not disproportionately large, but we know that they are famously intelligent. How did they develop their intelligence? Well, it may actually be to do with the evolution of this thing, their nose, the trunk, which is capable of remarkably fine manipulation. It is said, and I can quite believe it, that an elephant can pick up a grain of rice with its trunk. And that manipulative ability may well have been the spur for human intelligence, generally thought to be much more to do with group dynamics. I'm more persuaded more likely to do with manipulability. And the third thing I'll come back to in just a moment. In passing, you might be interested to know that the trunk probably originally evolved as a schnorkel, because the elephants were originally aquatic, as it happens. But in terms of their abilities, there are a number of interesting things. They are tool users, which is quite important. They have to swat themselves to get rid of parasitic flies, which are a major burden in terms of blood loss. And the great advantage is here we have a young elephant learning how to do it. Here we have a female elephant busy removing the flies there. The great advantage of this tool is having used it, you can then eat it, which is something of an advantage. In addition, they are capable of mirror self-recognition, which is extremely unusual. Again, goes fairly close to the general thing of what I am, what I think I am. Of course, you need an elephant-sized mirror. These are experiments done in the Bronx. You put a mark here. Then you introduce the elephant. And of course, first they look at it and say, oh, well, you know, something behind it. So they try and look behind the thing. And then they keep on doing various experiments to keep on resenting. And then you have the thing where they're suddenly touching. They think, that's me. That's me. It's nobody else. You know, it's me. And bonobos, dolphins, possibly parrots, ourselves, a handful of species are capable of that. But that's consistent with what we know about the elephants generally. But there are two other aspects about them which, again, especially for a Faraday meeting, I think might have some consequences for discussion. They are peculiarly interested in the remains of their own species. Not any old bones, but bones of elephants, and they are peculiarly interested in the ivory. There's some fascination in that material. They will return continuously to investigate this. And that aspect about something to do with death is also seen in their reaction to the dying. This is a famous set of photographs. I don't know if I have one or two of the matriarch here in Uganda, and she's in the process of dying here. This other one, believe it or not, is actually touching the matriarch gently. And the next photograph, and I don't think I have that. No, it doesn't. Tries to lift the elephant up, and thereafter about 5 or 6 different clans, which are not closely related to then the dead elephant, visit, and there's intense interest in this remains. And well, make of that what you will, but it seems to me that that is something which is curious, to put it mildly. Well, these aspects about the peculiarity of species and convergences might still run into the sand, because I use this slide quite often, and I say the same words, but it does seem to me, you know, what other species would regard that as a sensible thing to do? You have to give it to us, and just, you know, there's something very peculiar about us. And it might be the case, perhaps, in our own evolution, despite all these convergences. You know, there was one amino acid change, you know, we go off in a particular trajectory. But there too, I think there are a few straws in the wind to suggest that there are very considerable probabilities of ending up with something like ourselves. This may seem like special pleading, and I'll happily discuss it in more detail in the discussion if that's useful. But it's to do with the convergences we see between ourselves, here Homo sapiens, and here the Neanderthals. Now the Neanderthals are almost certainly a different species. They're also extinct. And by and large they are similar but not identical. They have a somewhat different brain structure, so far as we know, rather more sort of bun-shaped rather than this sort of football shape we have here. They are capable of precise articulation. Here we have a Neanderthal thumb and a Neanderthal finger, but that's not surprising because we know that they were skilled tool users. We know that they had fire. They very probably had clothing. They lived in a tundra environment. But most interesting of all, they actually buried their dead on occasion. And this is the famous Kabara burial in Israel. Of course, we have no idea, and this is in a sense echoing what I was saying about the elephants a moment ago, we have no idea why they buried their dead, for a whole set of reasons. But in this particular case, in fact, the skull has been removed. Again, we don't know why, only leaving the lower jaw there. But by and large, the Neanderthals have been regarded as runners-up. You know, jolly well done, as we would say in this country. Not bad at all. You know, do come for tea sometime. Which in England, by the way, means I don't want to see you again. That's another story. But shortly before their disappearance, they undergo this cultural efflorescence, which has a number of local names according to which European archaeological area you're in, but best known as the Château-Perronian from France. And this involves indubitably, incised teeth and bones and so forth, which presumably was some sort of necklace. And this is really a major cultural leap forward. And for a long time it has been thought that this was simply because Homo sapiens, our own species, is moving into contact with the Neanderthals, and trading or theft or imitation are then leading to the development of these advanced cultures. And of course we all know perfectly well from our own imitative abilities that we're not at all shy of stealing other people's ideas. But nevertheless, the fact of the matter is that although still very controversial, it is suggested that this is completely independent of Homo sapiens. It's got nothing to do with Homo sapiens at all. It's due to some rather complex arguments on cave stratigraphy, radiocarbon dating, previous cultural developments among the Neanderthals. But if that is the case, it does suggest that they have arrived at this solution in more or less the same way. So, although of course we are closely related, our common ancestor probably lived more than 500,000 years ago, but has ended up with something which is very human-like. And quite recently I came across another example which I think is important to stress, and that has to do with the invasion of Australia. Australia was colonised probably no earlier than 60,000 years ago by modern humans. No Neanderthals, nothing to do with that at all. Here we have a burial, this is the famous Lake Mungo burial here. But what we see is effectively the same sort of thing. Until about 7,000 years ago, they're really not doing very much. But about 7,000 years ago, they go through this cultural revolution where they begin to go towards what seems to be effectively dream time. They have complex rituals for burials. They have a much more common language. They have far more advanced technologies. Now, all aspects of that are interesting, I think, because they can be explained perfectly reasonably by saying, well, as population size grows, as various tribes make contact with each other, so you've got to come to a series of cultural accommodations and also cultural imitation and cultural innovation, which then kickstart you into a far more sophisticated set of societies. And I think that is actually correct, but of course the fact of the matter is that we're dealing also with such things as burial, we're dealing with such things as dream time, we're dealing with such aspects of this feeling that in some sense there's a numinous around us. And you can then ask yourself whether those are also automatically evolutionary consequences or whether they are beyond that. So let me just wrap up, if I can, with a couple of throwaway remarks. And if I have 3 minutes, would that be okay? Yes. Thank you. Another aspect about being a scientist is that it's very nice, though it's always nice if you manage to do it yourself rather than your competitors do it, but nevertheless it's very nice when the totally unexpected turns up. And again, if you're not a scientist, it's a little bit difficult to explain that, but again, because we sort of like to go to Sweden to meet the King of Sweden, get a small prize, that sort of rubbish like that, you know, there's an awful lot of self-congratulation, self-aggrandizement in science at the moment, and you know, a lot of people writing extremely tedious books about how brilliant they are. But the fact of the matter is, I already stressed, we actually know almost nothing. And one of the nicest things is when something turns up which nobody ever expected. And this, I think, may be one of the best examples in archaeology. Many of you already know about this case here from the island of Flores, which is part of the Indonesian archipelago. On the island of Flores, there is an archaeological record, but to everyone's intense surprise, a couple of years ago, these little hominids turned up here. This is the new species Homo floresiensis. And the point about this little chap is that this is a skull of an adult, but it has a brain the size of a chimpanzee. Now, indirect evidence suggests that they flourished from roughly 90,000 years ago to perhaps as recently as 12,000 years ago. And they have grown, being nicknamed hobbits. These are diminutive little chaps, as you might imagine, standing about 1 metre high. Now, a friend of mine here in Cambridge has a very unworthy suggestion, because we have every reason to think that though they themselves were sophisticated, they hunted, they had fire, and so forth, they coexisted with Homo sapiens, our own species. And he suggests, this is rather unworthy, he suggests actually they were servants, you know, because any of you who've been in Cambridge any time realise, you know, what a gilded life we lead here. And they used to come around the caves with trays of drinks like this, you know, gin and tonic, sir, white wine, sir, thank you, madam, thank you. And then, of course, went extinct, but they're no longer needed by the economics of the time. But the fascinating thing about these chaps is that, as I already mentioned, their brains are smaller, in fact, than a chimpanzee. And this is an endocast of that brain here in lateral view. And that has led to intense controversy. But effectively, the question for debate at the moment is it some sort of, you know, microcephalic dwarf? And that seems increasingly unlikely. There are various papers written on the scaling of this brain and the capacity of this brain, but to cut a fairly long story short, it is almost impossible to understand how these hominids were capable of thinking with a brain that size. Something simply doesn't add up here at all. It's mad. It's never what you'd expect. The other thing in passing worth mentioning is that it's probably a separate species, but unpublished work on the wrist structure hints that they may actually come from the Australopithecines. And as the Australopithecines we know beyond all doubt, because it says so in textbooks, never left Africa, then something may be seriously wrong with our understanding about human diasporas. But that too, I think, is a straw in the wind to what I want to conclude with, which is the notion which will be, I think, to a number of you reasonably comfortable area to think about, but from the point of view of straightforward science would be certainly suspect. And that is to do with the convergence of singing, which of course is found in the birds and ourselves, but also such groups here as the humpback whale. And there's a wonderful essay in Science published several years ago by a musicologist who points out that this convergence, of course, can be put in the context of the physics of sound production. But in addition, she says, well, it's music. You know, it's got harmony, and it's got invention, it's got melody. It's the things we enjoy listening to. They give to us an aesthetic experience. And despite protests to the contrary, I think that's true of birds. There are a number of anecdotal stories there as well. And she then proceeds on that basis and says, well, supposing, and I think this is the crucial point. I was very excited by this. I hadn't thought about it in that way at all. Supposing that there is a universal music, in other words, out there is a metaphysical realm whereby these things are eternally there. And in that sort of context, of course, you can see that evolution, be it in the convergence of singing, or be it in the convergence of mental capacities, actually is only a search engine for finding other things. And if that is true for music, if that is true for mentality, then just to provoke you, then I'm sure that's also true for religion. So I'll stop at that point. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Simon, for fascinating talk. So, yes, we got time for questions and discussion, and Joseph wants to.
So this is just a question because I'm not a biologist.
Excuse me, yes.
Just trying to find exactly where it is. At the beginning, one of the first slides, he talks about the three different strands of how evolution can happen in terms of adaptation, chance, and history. It seems very crucial that actually the main thing was adaptation. And it's basically just asking, what are those three things exactly? What's the difference between chance and history?
Oh, well, chance and history in a certain sense are related, because chance will involve any historical trajectory. Okay, but what one's doing in chance is one saying, you know, in any particular milk bottle, you know, things go in any direction you like, but effectively what you see is that that doesn't play into the story at all. But all the history is doing is saying, well, in each one of those 12 milk bottles, things are going in directions that actually turn out to be parallel to each other, because intuitively you'd imagine things go all over the place. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so adaptation is there.
Adaptation is simply is actually being in a Darwinian being sensible. Right. In other words, what you're doing is that as and when you, in this particular case, the way they drove the evolution is that E. coli likes a sugar called glucose, and they're very happy with that, as indeed they are in our guts, I'm pleased to say, as long as you've got the right E. coli in you, of course. But you then put them on a new substrate, which is maltose, which is another sugar, which they don't like at all. So they have to adapt to that new substrate, and it's the adaptation to that environmental challenge, which then, in principle, you might say, well, given that they're all facing a challenge, they would solve it in lots of different sorts of ways, and given their different histories, they would do it in different stages at different times, all the things which we would normally associate with human history. That may not actually be correct even for human history, as it turns out, but that's the aspect. But I should have mentioned that, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Just not a biologist.
No, that's a big, yeah, that's the point. Yeah.
Thanks. Yes, James.
And I heard that you had a debate with Stephen Jay Gould, and each other pointing the others as your metaphysical or your belief actually influence your interpretation of your scientific evidence. What is your take about that?
Well, that's a very fair question, but I think that has to be true of all of us. I mean, everybody has a metaphysics, whether they like it or not. They don't even know they've got it, so to speak. But in the case of Gorm, it was one very much based on sort of human freedom. So in principle, that was actually, first step, that's a very reasonable thing, because it as is sometimes difficult to explain to some people in some parts of the world, we have to be responsible agents. And I think I have reason to believe that Gould's concern about this was that he had some Hungarian ancestors, and some of those were Jews, and a good number of those were deported late in the war and murdered by the Nazis. And again, it's easy to get sort of not sentimental about this, but having just read a recent book about a lawyer who actually fled Nazi Germany, he was not Jewish himself. What happened there is so much beyond belief that people, especially of Gould's generation, very slightly close to those events, thought, well, the only way we're going to dig our way out of this problem is not to have our way stuck into systems whereby it appears that we are dictated by particular belief systems. And of course, to a certain extent, that's true of Dawkins's view in his God delusion. I mean, I think the book is dreadful, and I think it's very badly written, and I think it's intellectually irresponsible. But despite that, I mean, one can see that there is an argument there. It's not one I would subscribe to, and I don't think he makes the argument in any coherent fashion at all. But yes, and I would think his metaphysics is broadly nihilistic. I think that would be fair to say. But it's nevertheless a metaphysics. So yes, but everybody has that. But I think from the aspects of how one's trying to do one's science, there is a considerable danger, and I don't want to subscribe to that at all, to say we will never understand things, because that's effectively the avenue used, I think, more or less by intelligent design. It will effectively use a gaps argument. And I was at a very interesting talk in Lancaster a couple of days ago where a very clever mathematician was saying, well, maybe the origin of life fits into that category. Well, he might be right, of course, but I don't see any reason to give a hostage to fortune, because if it turns out we come up with a very satisfactory way whereby you use a very icy environment, such as you might find on a comet, which is periodically warmed, which then allows complex molecules to aggregate and then be frozen in position before they're warmed again in a cyclical way as a comet approaches the sun, then in that aspect it may be that things actually fall together in a rather straightforward fashion. So I would not want to use that as an argument. On the other hand, my sense is, especially with the questions of consciousness and sentience and so forth, as a way I was hinting with respect to the fact that we almost know nothing at all, is my guess is that such science as we have will be completely different from anything we understand at the moment. And I think that's actually quite important. Again, it needn't encourage everybody here, but my view is that this sort of agenda is far more exciting. It's got far more to go for it. It's far more interesting. I mean, quite frankly, I think that people like Dennett and Dawkins, to the very first approximation, have actually, as I've said elsewhere, run out of things to say. I mean, what, is that all they're going to say? Is that all there is to it? The sort of, well, that's that. Oh, come on. I don't think so at all.
I follow a little bit on that. Yes, sometimes people accusing there's a God of gap theory. But it looks like for traditional paleontologists or biologists, there's a nature of a gap. How do you explain it? The nature will do it. Looks like you are looking for a deeper level of a design, so to speak, or a deeper level of meaning behind all of this.
Well, yeah,
is that true?
That's true. That's because that's one's metaphysics. I mean, but I think theologically, I think it's fairly unproblematic. Any one of your excursions, first of all, is always going to be accompanied by doubt and uncertainty. People who think, in my view, that somehow they're going to be a set of fixed answers are going to be severely disappointed. Not least because there's no reason to think that the inquiry we could engage in could be effectively universal. It could be completely open-ended. I'm sorry about the noise here. But when you're talking about the paleontology and the gaps and so forth, I don't think there are gaps there at all. No, I mean, the work we do on the Cambrian explosion, effectively what we're trying to show, we may be wrong, of course, I'm not bothered about that, we usually are, but we are dealing with particular fossils which look completely different from anything we ever expected, and some of them have remained very problematic. But to the first approximation, I think we've now got the making of a fairly coherent story about things which apparently look entirely disparate are actually far more closely related than we might expect. But there are hypotheses, of course, on that. But I would agree with you entirely. I mean, why is science so unpopular in the West, for example? Well, I think there are a number of good reasons, but one of them is that it's no longer regarded as an adventure. partly because it's actually a very expensive adventure at the best of times, but you know, the general sort of intellectual curiosity and the intellectual stimulation to some extent has disappeared. Whereas when you read the people, you know, who are really enthralled by this area, they don't, I think, by and large, think that somehow the whole thing is now in a set of neat, tidy boxes, which again been then put in the fridge and forgotten.
Okay, so please.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit more, Simon, about the notion of fine-tuning here, because in the context of cosmology, it seems to be almost the reverse of what you mean by fine-tuning is almost exactly the reverse of what it means in cosmology. In the case of cosmology, the idea is that the initial parameters have to be very special in order to get where we are today.
Yeah.
Now, you're almost saying the opposite of that. I think if you go to your lonely planet, that's going to be closer to fine-tuning in the cosmological sense. But if you stick to our own planet, it seems to me that what you don't have almost is fine-tuning in that other sense. Because what you're saying is that even with different conditions, there is a convergence. So there's no initial fine-tuning. What happens is that there's a convergence. Now, that's not fine-tuning as that term is used in cosmology. Am I right about that?
No, that's perfectly fair, Ernan. I think you're touching on areas which I'm not, first of all, very competent to talk about. And the way you put it, I think, is a very fair summary of where things are. To try and answer it in a nutshell, as St. Julian once said, to begin with, it may turn out that there really is a fine-tuning argument to do with this planet. It may turn out to be just in exactly the right position in all respects. That's obviously not the consequence of the anthropic fine-tuning which the physicists talk about. That, you know, as this sort of picture's trying to show, at the moment just seems fantastically unlikely. Just because, you know, we know the number of extrasolar systems, one can extrapolate to the Earth-like planets, which effectively are now detectable, and the estimates are that there will be many more than the super Jupiters. And if every one of them, as a friend of mine says, is quote another dead planet, well, then that may be the case, and it may simply be that the origin of life itself is simply a fluke. It really was just one of those big chemical accidents which only happened once, and it happened to be on this planet, so that's the end of the story. But I think the slightly wider view, if that's the right way to put it, is again, in a way, to go back to effectively creation theology, if you like, and say, yes, I have to keep a completely open mind about the just 6 numbers of Martin Rees and so forth, because as other people have pointed out, first of all, and I know you know much more about the physics than I do. First of all, we don't actually know why those numbers are the numbers they are. They bear no relation to each other so far as anybody can tell at the moment. More particularly, as has also been pointed out by Neil Manson, it's quite possible, in fact, that there are alternative universes with equally fine-tuned numbers, which bear no relation to the numbers we know. We just haven't the foggiest idea, of course. But what one can say is in the instantiation of the Big Bang, which is about as far back as we are likely to go for the foreseeable future, if that's not an oxymoron, then we have in that sort of instantiation all further potentialities, including, you know, the ability for you and I to have this discussion like that. And just from that perspective, again, I mean, some people aren't persuaded by this sort of world picture, but if I sort of see this sea of quarks, or whatever they are at that stage, and sort of emerge with this sort of area here, I'm just gobsmacked. And I just think it's astonishing how precisely it's put together. And in a certain way, so far as an echo of fine-tuning in biology, it is, as I mentioned in passing, my suspicion, but it's no more than that, that practically nothing works. It's not a question of most things do. In fact, if you look at the available spaces, almost nothing is there at all. So there is an aspect of the fine-tuning there, but again, biology is, in that sense, as Milani pointed out, different, and then when we get into the area of the matter which can understand itself, i.e. our sentience, then I think we are going into effectively what, from our perspective, appear to be completely different realms. But they're very familiar, of course. They've just been neglected. So I don't think I've really answered your question at all, but it's a comment, if you like.
There's a question, yes.
Yes. Your example of convergences, are you saying you're making, or would be willing to make a link between convergence and a general directional arc with evolution as a whole? And one other part of the question, some clarification I could get from you is these convergences you mentioned, the factors that might be responsible for that. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? And would that be consonant with the creator God?
Well, in a nutshell, again, yes, it could, if you so wish. The directionality one has to be a little bit careful about, in as much as, again, this is the standard Dawkins argument. So if I tell you about pathogenic bacteria, which generally are pretty uncomfortable for us, it so turns out that the majority of pathogens, and actually various other symbionts, one of the first things they do is they throw away most of their genome. They're incredibly lazy. They use your genome to make nearly everything they need. But the fact of the matter is that they do it in exactly the same way. So there's a predictability about what parts of the genome you will lose, irrespective of what sort of pathogenic bacteria you are. And that, of course, has a plus side, because it means that one may be able to manipulate things, because it's got a negative side, because if you wish to use pathogenic bacteria for, say, warfare, then you might be better informed than your enemies, because you've got biological knowledge, so it's two-edged to the end. So it's, when you say directionality, of course, where we stand, and so far as we know, we're the only species which has become interested metaphysically in these areas, it's very easy to identify ourselves, you know, on this wonderful pinnacle with all life beneath us. We've been there before, haven't we? Yes, exactly. Whereas, of course, if you then stand slightly back and say, well, this is a creation, which involves a little bit more than ourselves, even though, as you might agree, one's in the image of God, and that, again, is a perfectly comfortable way of looking at things. The idea is not then to go into sort of, you know, into sort of Milton-esque suzerainty, if you like. So it's, yeah, it's a balance. Is not quite the right way to put it. But yes, those things are consistent. So I don't know. Again, does that?
Yeah. And the factors that you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
You mentioned substrate, and I was.
Well, so that's a very imperfect metaphor. I mean, my thinking's hardly advanced there at all. But then they are. I mean, of course, all sciences use metaphors and iconography. Again, as Gould correctly emphasised. And the landscape metaphors in biology, of course, have been very widespread since the time, certainly of Saul Wright and Conrad Waddington, in rather different contexts, an adaptive landscape or an epigenetic landscape. But the general notion would be that, and this is, a part of the problem here is, of course, you're dealing with something which in many respects is not three-dimensional, you're dealing with many more dimensional possibilities. But there is, for want of a better word, a pre-existing substrate across which evolution is forced to navigate. And there may be particular high roads, compound eyes, camera eyes. There may be little side alleys, mirror eyes and Scotland, for example. But if you look at the map, what you'll see is what is effectively an enormously steep topography of inaccessibility, threaded through by narrow silver lanes, most of which are repeatedly revisited. But it is very strongly a metaphor. But it presumably would have ultimately some sort of mathematical description.
Yeah, I just get the sense from a lot of biologists who seem very open to this idea of a general directionality, let's say to complex consciousness, maybe,
Yes.
I don't know, that they almost have to then move to like poetic metaphorical description, maybe because it's so complicated, what might be the causative factors.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And of course I have colleagues and friends who are mathematicians who talk in a language I can't possibly understand. But I think it's worth thinking that there are other sort of contexts in theology in particular, and especially, I mean, I was just talking about this to a couple of colleagues the other day with regard to the nature miracles in particular, and also the resurrection. This is something which will not be comfortable to a number of people here, but the point there, which I think is still legitimate to talk about, is that one has no vocabulary to deal with that. That all words fail. And if you then sort of put yourself in that sort of context, of course science is good at making new vocabularies. It is good at finding new ways of defining things. But one should not be surprised in the way that very quickly, as you absolutely correctly, and I completely agree with you, the only effective way is to use poetry. Because that, as you know better than I do, the ability to make one line mean 40 things is pretty impressive. But it's not science.
Okay, so yeah, we'll go to Peter and then to Joseph.
Coming back to this question of fine-tuning, which is related also to the question of convergence and so on, it seems to me that there's a slight confusion because the word fine-tuning, as it's used in physics, is not really correct. Because when you talk about tuning, you're thinking of an engineering device which changes the value of a variable to, for for example, the frequency on the radio which actually picks up the message. Whereas the physicists are actually talking about a constant that has a value and that does not change. Now, if you come back to what you said about the mathematics, I mean, it's the mathematics of convergence, and as you know, there's a whole field of mathematics, stability analysis, which focuses exactly on that. And basically, what the mathematicians do is they've got constants that will not vary, and then the biology is not talking about that at all. The biology is talking about what does vary. And so the fine-tuning, if you like, in the title of your talk today, is a correct use of the word fine-tuning, but it's just a different sense of the word fine-tuning to that of the physicists.
Well, yeah, as I say, Ernest's much more of an expert now. I'm not mathematical at all. But if I understand your as much a comment as well as a question correctly, I mean, I don't have any particular quarrel with that. But it is in the same the problem of you know, the one and the many. It's on one sense we are very comfortable by and large with abstracts which are effectively, you know, for want of a better word, effectively can be eternal. We know they're not in their own way unfamiliar concepts. But on the other hand, we, as you know, Heraclitean, we're sort of stuck in this continuous flux of change. And then especially when you're dealing with things to do with, say, ethical decisions, for example, with chimeras, for example, you know, it's not clear, you know, what's quite the difference. Because if genomically we share about as much in common with the banana as we do with the fly, it's not quite as simple as that, you know. One's dealing with areas which, of course, are very muddy and very difficult to discuss in any sort of way. But what I think is helpful, and I'm not articulating this at all clearly, is the sense that, such as the example of the music I was using, and a number of other examples I think will come very quickly to mind, one is being invited, for want of a better word, to discover things which, although are unchanging, are infinitely rich. And I mean, the only way we can get there is, you know, through the business of going through evolution and going through our embryology and all the rest of it. And it may, from some perspectives, and again I can imagine a theological stance on this, seem a very odd way of doing it. There's a standard complaint, in fact, you know, things are organised in that sort of way. Why couldn't he have done it in some other way? Well, we have not got the foggiest idea, but that seems to be the way we have to use our escalator we're given. So I know, I say it's a comment as much in return to what you were saying. Cheers.
So, similar question actually, just carrying on with this idea. So is it not possible that there's kind of two stages here, that the cosmological fine-tuning right up to the point of the Earth being ripe and ready for life to evolve is kind of one stage, and actually there's three stages, and then there's two stages of evolution. The first stage being that from life being a possibility, it's kind of spread out into this huge biodiversity, and then the third stage being that it's now converging onto, I suppose ultimately, go back to the inevitable human idea. So you've kind of got cosmological fine-tuning, evolutionary biodiversity, and then evolutionary convergence.
It can be read that way. I wouldn't want to take it the whole way. I mean, and no doubt you're familiar with, and probably more familiar than I am with, for instance, some of the writings of Teilhard de Chardin, who, of course, you know, mostly in this country, you know, people are back, and so on. But there's more of his work which is worth discussing, I think, than it's been given credit for many years. But my slight reluctance to engage fully with that area is there's a risk, in a sense, going back to the question about directionality and ourselves being the end point of evolution, to forget the rest of creation in which we're embedded. And I'm sort of pretty nervous on this idea, because it does seem to me that one aspect about, you know, one of the many shortcuts to hell, which are being presently offered, is this sort of idea that somehow we can become immortal, for instance, through various sort of in silico devices. And again, it's all to do with human surviving and stuff the rest of the planet, frankly, you know, all sorts of hideous endpoints, which could easily mean that, you know, it's great for human mentality, but it means nothing to anybody else. And I don't think that's meant to be part of the deal. But that description, if you like, of the sort of quasi-omega point, I think has, you know, is an important part of the argument, but I think it has to be handled with care.
I think just got time for one last question before coffee. Jeff, do you want to? I think I saw a hand.
So, well, back to this fine-tuning thing. I'm just wondering if I'm putting words in your mouth, or if you'll. It seems to me the cosmological fine-tuning arguments emphasize the precision of the constants necessary for life to evolve. So they emphasize necessary preconditions. But then there's also the question of sufficiency, whether in fact the physical constants that constrain possibility space are sufficient to guarantee or at least tilt evolution toward the outcomes that we've had. And is that latter sense the sense in which you're, the sense of sufficiency, not necessity?
Well,
Play the tapes again and we're likely to get what we have by virtue of fundamental physical
Well,
constraints.
yeah, maybe. No, I take your point, and I think that's a perfectly fair analysis. But my comment, rather than perhaps less helpfully than a reply, is that there would be perhaps an argument to say, let us say Conway Morris managed to identify the rule of evolution, so he goes off to Sweden, gets his prize, all the rest of it, blah, blah, blah. And then the sort of a feeling of deep despair goes across the whole human race, because that's another thing which is now under control. It's all inevitable. There's nothing you can do about it. And of course, I don't need to emphasise anybody here that those sorts of ideas in the hands of mischief makers in Berlin in 1933 or elsewhere at the present day are very bad news indeed, for self-evident reasons. It's as much comment. It is my instinct, and it's a little more at the moment. And I've been thinking about this a little bit for the last couple of years. Is simply the open-endedness of the thing which we've been asked to engage in, and I think this is something which scientists, for instance, John Hogan has his rather well-known book called The End of Science. He's an interesting individual. I suppose that's one way of putting it. The idea is when he talks to these people, they're all a bit gloomy. I don't know what we're going to do in the next few years. Well, that may be, as ever, it's an open-ended bet we're on, and it may turn out in 50 years' time we're back on poetry. We've done it. It's all been understood. It's all tied up. And but I think that's highly unlikely. I think it's an intuition, no more than that. So the way you put it about the sufficiency and the necessity of it, I don't in no way want to be rude about that reply, but frankly I find it a little bit constraining. I understand philosophically they're an essential aspect of any argument, but if we're going to take creation, well, not seriously, but if we take it as I think is sometimes forgotten, it's very much a paradox. As I said, on the one hand you have St. Julian with, that is the nut in the hand, is the whole thing. She saw it, beyond any reasonable doubt. But on the other hand, so far as we are concerned, we have no idea how it will end. We're completely open-ended. And, the very fact that people are so anxious to have control on their lives at the moment, I think is a reflection of that existentialist nervousness, frankly. I don't blame anybody. Of course we want a safe life, but it's not clear to me that's going to be on the cards. You go back to Dante in particular, as I was talking to another friend of mine. Everything is on a knife edge. Everything is on a knife edge.